Welcome to Fridays with Fintelekt. My guest today is Peter Piatetsky, co-founder and CEO at Castellum.AI. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Shirish. Very happy to be here. You've done a lot of great work and very happy to be one of your guests.
Thanks, Peter, for the kind words. Much appreciated. Peter, the mission statement for Castellum.AI is to organize the world's compliance data and make it universally accessible and useful. So at the outset, can you give our audience an overview of your career so far, which included working in the US Treasury and being associated with the US Army, and how it finally culminated in you co-founding Castellum.AI with this mission statement?
When I started working at the US Treasury, I worked on Iran issues at OFAC. I wrote designation packages, and I moved then to an intelligence office and worked on Russia and Eastern European money laundering. And my last job at Treasury was in the policy office, and I was senior policy advisor for Iran. And Iran is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world. And so I frequently had this issue come up where senior leadership would come and say, "Hey, Peter, we have, this foreign leader coming. Write me a talking point about Iran sanctions." And talking point was generally, here are US sanctions. This is who we have on our list. These are your sanctions lists. And the talking point would say, take someone from the US sanctions list and put them on your sanctions list. So it sounds like an extremely simple question. You compare, let's say, the Japanese sanctions list and the US sanctions list. What's the delta? And then, whoever is not on the Japanese sanctions list, you say, please add these people. And what I found was that was actually insanely difficult. And I had no idea that was the case. But this is kind of the origin of Castellum.AI, which is being at Treasury, I couldn't find and didn't know who was on other sanctions lists. And it wasn't just Japan, it was Japan, South Africa, Germany, Peru, Mexico. I knew it was really a problem when nobody at Treasury could help me find the Canadian sanctions list. And it's not because my colleagues weren't smart, they're all very smart. It's simply that governments all over the world do a terrible job of providing this data. So it's kind of a real problem for businesses and for compliance, because governments say, you have to follow the sanctions. If you don't follow the sanctions, we'll fine you. And then de facto, it's extremely difficult to find this data, and the best way to do it is to pay a compliance vendor. But as anyone has worked with a large compliance vendor, you have to schedule a demo, listen to sales pitches, get custom pricing. It's very difficult. And our mission at Castellum.AI is to build basically the Google for compliance. So an online platform, which is extremely easy to access at a very affordable price point, so that anyone globally can find data. And really, it's the best businesses are the ones that solve a problem that is real and that you've had, and this is solving that problem.
So, Peter, what changes have you seen in the nature of sanctions being levied globally over the years? Is there a trend towards the use of sanctions, not just for diplomatic reasons or to counter terrorism, but also for other issues such as corruption or human rights violations?
Yeah, I think your question really lays all of it out, right? I'd say the biggest change that has happened in sanctions, and if you want to go way back, some people could say the first sanctions that happened in ancient Greece, and some will say, well, sanctions really started during World War II in the US and UK with various export controls, but really modern sanctions started with 9/11. And in the 1990s, you did have some sanctions globally imposed by countries, and in the US particular is focused on Cuba, Iraq, and Yugoslavia. And so you had kind of in the 90s, really broad sanctions that essentially said, you can't do business with country X, period. And there was a lot of criticism of these type of sanctions, that they were punishing the innocent without actually affecting governments. And when 9/11 happened, the US government said, all right, we need every single tool available. And among others, Treasury came up with solutions. They said, look, we can impose sanctions. And so 9/11, September 11th, I think September 24th, there was an executive order with kind of the first really organized targeted sanctions program. So it was no longer we're going to go after a country, it was we're going to go after individuals. And the follow-on to that was how the US pushed us internationally. So the US worked at the United Nations to push through Resolution 1373, which is really kind of the mother of all global sanctions programs, because UN Resolution 1373 required countries to follow UN sanctions and also push through sanctions on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And so you kind of have 9/11, you have US sanctions, you have US pushing for sanctions at the UN, and then you have the Financial Action Task Force, your global standard setter, which basically goes around the world, and I was lucky enough to be an assessor for FATF as well, goes around the world in checks, and they grade every country, and they'll say, do you impose UN sanctions or not? They ask hundreds of other questions, but that's one of them. And so countries slowly all over the world started building programs to follow sanctions because they wanted to get a good grade from FATF. So it's very much a long-term process, but you go from, we're going to go after a country to, okay, we're going to go after individuals. You have then in the 2010s and with kind of significant pressure on Iran and Russia globally, sectoral sanctions. So you go from just a country to this terrorist to a sector. So automotive sector in Iran, or deep water drilling in Russia. And that was a different type of sanctions. And now you have not necessarily a different type of sanctions, but the use of licenses a lot. So a government will, impose potentially very broad sanctions. So it'll impose sanctions not necessarily against the whole government, but will say this sector, that sector, these people, these government agencies, and people want to know, is there anything left I can do? We're kind of back to square one, where governments are de facto sanctioning, an entire region. And so there's a really prolific use of licenses. And the licenses say you can provide software, educational software, you can provide educational materials, you can provide humanitarian needs. In some cases, there's even carve-outs that say a terrorist group might control this territory, but you can still work in that territory to provide aid. And specifically, that's the case of Al-Shabaab. But you see the evolution of the tool. And then in terms of focus, like you said, Shirish, went from a very political to kind of a more counter-terrorism focus. Then there was a law enforcement focus added. So there's a lot of anti-narco trafficking sanctions and cybercrime sanctions. And now finally, again, we're kind of back to square one with the corruption and human rights sanctions. You could argue those are law enforcement, you could argue those are political, but that's the latest use of the tool. And just some quick numbers in terms of Russia has the largest sanctions list globally, about 12,000 names on it. US is after, but in terms of focus, kind of US has 81 different lists. They have for Iran, they have 20 different lists. For North Korea, they have 5 or 6, but that shows you the breadth of US focus. European Union has 31, and then the United Nations has 14. So even with the UN, there's 14 different sanctions programs the whole world can agree on. And then, you have China and India that are recently joining the sanctions scene. China has less than 100 people. It's named, and it's a kind of very political program there. India's program is much more, we're going to use UN sanctions, but India designates groups that are basically terrorist groups that operate within India. So to kind of wrap up the question, it's really modern sanctions begin with 9/11, and we've seen the tool expand in many different ways. And now it's something that's a tool that's used globally for pretty much every single reason.
I've asked many of my guests earlier whether sanctions have been successful as a useful diplomatic tool, and I get mixed reactions from them. So I'm going to rephrase that question a bit for you. What would you say are the successes of global sanctions policies?
To use probably a bad allegory, but it's Sanctions are a really powerful tool. They're like an F1 car, and depending on who the driver is, you're going to get different results. So it's really kind of what track are you at? Who's the driver? What's the team supporting it? It's people often like to say, well, sanctions either don't work or work, but it's a lot more complicated than that. And the most important goal is, what does work mean? I mean, I'm not trying to not answer your question. I think the best way to answer your question is sanctions can be very successful if there's a specific goal. And that's rare. Most often, kind of once countries have realized that sanctions are really effective, they started using them for everything. And oftentimes there's not a specific goal. And so the question is, are the sanctions treating the symptoms, or are the sanctions treating the disease? And if your goal is to treat the symptoms, then, and you do that effectively, then that's great. And one of the best kind of effects of sanctions is in blunting terrorism finance. So this is a clear case of treating the symptoms. Sanctions are not going to de-radicalize people, stop people from kind of joining terrorist groups. That's not their goal, and they're never going to do that. But sanctions do make it much more difficult to finance terrorism. And sanctions have led to kind of following the money on terrorist networks, to dismantling terrorist networks, to arrest of terrorist financiers, and also to kind of actually helping out the charity sector a lot, where previously there were a lot of charities that were either abused or sometimes complicit, and now there's a lot more clarity. So I think that might be the best success of sanctions, in where they're treating the symptoms. In terms of where sanctions, there's been a clear diplomatic goal. I'd say internationally, the Iran deal, which was then dismantled by the Trump administration, is the best example where the international community, US, Russia, Europe, China set goals of, we want Iran to come to a deal, years of negotiations, and escalating sanctions pressure. So there was a very specific goal. We want Iran to stop its nuclear program, and negotiations were done internationally, and that goal was achieved. It does show you the problem that you have with sanctions as a tool, which is there was a US election and the US president said, I don't like it, and ruined the whole program. So, but in this case, they were unquestionably successful. I think the most successful case of sanctions ever is actually by President Trump, where he used sanctions like no one else before. He was ready to use it for any purpose. And there was an American pastor who was imprisoned in Turkey, and he said, release this guy. I don't want him to be in jail. And Turkey said no. And so Trump sanctioned several Turkish ministers. And this guy was out of jail in like several days. And a lot of people didn't, including myself, thought this was not a great or even good use of sanctions, to use it so specifically for one case. But it worked. It was also probably the most narrow use of sanctions ever. Like the goal of this entire sanctions program was to get one person out of jail. Having said that, nothing else the US government did work. So to round back to your question, sanctions really depend, whether they work or not is going to depend on the goal, and whether you want to treat the symptoms or the disease, and also how small or big the goal is. The bigger the goal, the harder it is to accomplish. And I think most of the time now, sanctions are imposed without any clear goals, which makes it difficult for them to succeed.
It has now been over a fortnight since the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. What measures should the international community be thinking about next to influence the Taliban's policies?
Yeah, I think it's a very simple answer, just wait and see. And I know you want more, but I think it comes down to, nobody wants to see Afghan civilians are hurt any more than they already have been, and no one wants to see mass starvation. At the same time, if the Taliban start executing people in stadiums, publicly torturing people, and kind of continuing the type of behavior that they had when they were in power, nobody's going to want to support them either. And they've said that they're going to be moderate. We really haven't had enough time to tell. And also, we don't know what that means. Like, somebody can say that they're moderate, and for ISIS that might have meant that we're not going to throw people off of buildings or burn them alive. We're just going to execute them in public. So we really need to see what moderation means. And but I think everyone in the private sector right now, if they haven't already, should immediately stop all business with Afghanistan, period, because the Taliban remains sanctioned internationally and domestically by most countries. We don't know what they're going to do, and it is definitely a violation of sanctions. Now, whether governments are going to crack down on people that are kind of working in Afghanistan is a very different story. And so you have, for example, international money remitters like MoneyGram, Western Union, and RIA, and others who have reached out to governments, including the US, and said, hey, what can we do? Because they are one of the biggest sources of financial inflows to Afghanistan, which is Afghans outside the country sending money back. And governments have initially told them to wait and then said, okay, look, you can start again, but we might tell you to stop. So there's private sector and charities should definitely be in close communication, but this is something where there's no clarity, because I think the Taliban themselves aren't sure what they're going to do. And so we're waiting to see, the international community is waiting to see what they're going to do. But one thing is for certain is that they're likely going to be receiving some aid from Pakistan. They received military, financial, and material from Pakistan throughout the entire war. And the question will not be a big one: is Pakistan going to support the civilian community there, or was it just going to support the war?
Peter, you released a very interesting report in June of this year, when sanctions violate human rights. This was done with the Atlantic Council. For the benefit of our listeners, can you speak about that report and its key takeaways?
Yeah, and thank you for going through that. So it was the quick takeaways on that report are that sanctions and unilateral sanctions don't necessarily violate human rights. It's when sanctions are imposed arbitrarily. And we did not try to reinvent the wheel and say, well, this is what human rights are, this is what a violation of human rights is. We very simply went to UN Charter of Human Rights and looked there kind of what is considered a violation of human rights. And for sanctions, there's a very clear connection, which is when people are arbitrarily deprived of their property. So that's what sanctions do. Sanctions deprive you of your property, whether it's your money or your vehicles or your home. That's what sanctions do. And so what we really focused in was the word arbitrary. And because, again, governments are allowed to do that. The UN encourages even people to be deprived of their property if it's for reasons of, let's say, crime or terrorism. And so we did a global survey of sanctions programs, and we looked to see which ones provided the most public information, which ones explained the most. And we, at Castellum.AI, we always do our best to let the data tell the story and come to data-driven conclusions. So we try to make sure that whatever opinions we have are not factored in. And in kind of looking at that, we found that Russia, Pakistan, and Turkey have very large programs, and also they provide not a lot of information for why people are listed, and the programs are pretty arbitrary. And one thing that's interesting, as we found for Russia, is Russia lists a very large amount of religious groups on its terrorism watch lists. And even Russian President Putin, at one point, he was asked during a press conference, why are there over 400 sanctions on Jehovah's Witnesses? And he said that this is really weird. I don't think they should be on there, but they're still on there. So you have cases that are arbitrary, where there's no explanation for why someone is a terrorist. And what we see as, and that's another thing, which is So we looked at UN rules for human rights, and then we looked at FATF rules for imposing sanctions. Again, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. UN and FATF set the standards, and we're trying to see what data follows them. And in FATF's guidance, they really hammer that sanctions should be targeted at crime and terrorism. Now, FATF gives broad leeway to people to define crime and terrorism. What FATF we think doesn't do enough of is to focus on ensuring that there's basically public explanations to prevent arbitrary sanctions. Right now, FATF will come into a country and say, do you follow US sanctions or UN sanctions, yes or no? Do you have an avenue for delisting? It's definitely a bit of a checkmark process. It is extremely important, but I think it's time for FATF to move into the next phase, which is to look at, are your sanctions fair? Are you actually targeting people that are involved in financial crime, or is it more political? But the big takeaways from the report are sanctions definitely violate human rights, but whether they do so depends on whether they're arbitrary and if governments explain why. And just because sanctions are unilateral doesn't make them violations of human rights.
What are your views on the US-China sanctions conflict, if I may call it that, which seems to be intensifying rapidly? Are there solutions likely through dialogue, or has that ship already sailed?
I think the ship is actually still in port. I think over the summer, we saw that the ship getting loaded with cargo, the sails being unfurled, the crew being, packing their bags. It was definitely ready to escalate. And the biggest part of that is the anti-foreign sanctions law. And China passed the anti-foreign sanctions law and applied it to China. And then China was going to have the same law passed in Hong Kong, and China now has complete control over Hong Kong. So it was, if Beijing wanted it done, it would have been done. And it was literally, I think, it was scheduled for a reading in the Hong Kong legislature, and it was going to be passed, and then it didn't. And it would have been very interesting to be a fly on the wall in Beijing to see why they made that decision. But that would have been, I think, without kind of any exaggeration, catastrophic for the business community in Hong Kong, because what that law effectively says is you have to choose between the West, US and Europe, or China for businesses. And most of the businesses in Hong Kong are so successful because they are a bridge between the West and China. So forcing kind of the bridge to choose, you split it in half, and everybody loses. Now, I think the only other cases where there's significant sanctions on such a large and important player is US and European Union sanctions on Russia. Ironically, I think the West and Russia have an advantage is because of the Cold War, where they know how to dislike each other for a very long time without escalating into a serious conflict. And with China, the West does not have that experience, and China doesn't have that experience with the West. So it's unclear where this conflict is going to go. There really hasn't been a Cold War in modern times between China and the West, but I think there's kind of what was different here is that China is definitely rising, and China is not interested in being told what to do. Is not interested in being told that it's bad. Doesn't matter if it's right or not. They don't want to hear it. And the question is, to what extent are they willing to make that goal of kind of being a top dog more important than their economic interests? Because their economic interests are to just complain about sanctions and Western sanctions and ignore it and keep going. But there's a very powerful faction in Beijing which sees this as losing face and does not want to lose face. So I think, right, to kind of go back to your question, the ship is still in port, but it's ready to sail at any moment. And we could really kind of any provocation from either side, or anything seen as a provocation, could lead to kind of a quick economic escalation where businesses are suddenly either in violation of Chinese law or in violation of US law. And the question is then going to be, are US regulators going to enforce? Are Chinese regulators going to enforce? And if they do, that's bad for business. If they don't, they're seen as weak. So it becomes a situation that spirals out of control quickly.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. It was fantastic speaking with you.
Thank you for having me, and look forward to seeing this.